for the couple of last 2 years was already, I would argue, would have been impossible without kind of digital help and modeling tools. The degree of complexity we manage to organize there, but I think there's still much more in store for us in terms of dynamic modeling we want to get into, and also certain analytic concepts which could be retrieved, as it were, through certain programs. And there's a kind of series of 8 lectures for the next 3 weeks, always Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, about 4:30, sometimes 3:30, sometimes 5:30, where we introduce protagonists in various fields. And it's a kind of an overall browsing exercise, I would argue. The sequence was more kind of question of logistics, of matching timetables. But all of these lectures, I would argue, could be counted as protagonists in expanding the tools and digital kind of environments which we could kind of start to incorporate in our work. The first lecture is Alan Penn, who is one of the directors of Space Syntax Laboratory at the Bartlett UCL, an academic organization which also takes on these days real-life kind of commissions, and developed a series of very interesting, I would argue, analytical concepts and worked them through into kind of operationalized formalisms and computer programs. I saw Alan the first time at the first International Syntax Conference, which I think was 1.5 years ago. And was particularly captured my imagination was a program, one of his projects he's working on, called Pangea, which allows a kind of 3D environment which sets various objects you could model within that into kind of quite open-ended sets of relations. And that is something I wanted to test some of you to how we could work with that. Also, Alan is kind of teaching in the virtual environment design kind of master's course at the Bartlett, and that might pick up some notions we've discussed this morning of what the potentials are of fusing or electronically enhancing space and fusing virtual and real space, etc. Okay, so keep in mind Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday on a regular basis, and I welcome Alan Penn just to head off.
Right, thanks. This is going to be a bit of a tester, actually. I'm trying to put together several things that I haven't put together in this sort of order before. I've titled this Virtual Space and Virtual Organizations. And I'm going to really try and talk about the main body of this is really talking about a corporate organization. It's talking about an advertising agency and what we understand by the nature of organization, but also how that beds into the buildings that organizations inhabit and what the impacts of new technologies are in that whole process. This whole field is moving incredibly rapidly. Organizations are restructuring, technology is advancing, everything's changing, and we're in the lucky position of having developed research tools and research methods which are actually being used by some organizations that are trying to think through new ways of working and the new ways they're going to develop their buildings and the new ways they're going to use their technologies. Now, that is his research by design, but what we try to put together in our research group is actually a whole range of different aspects of research. So I'm going to give you, to take a medical analogy, I'm going to be doing a bit of a presentation of some sort of theoretical mathematics. I'm going to be presenting some work which is really, I suppose, to do with the epidemiology of buildings, how it is that they behave as statistical objects when they're occupied by people, what the regularities are in the way that people inhabit spaces inside buildings. I'm going to do a bit of talking about mechanisms. Take medical analogy of research, they call that etiology in the etiology of disease, understanding the mechanism by which things actually happen. You need to understand both the statistics, the epidemiology of it, and the etiology of it if you're going to intervene. You have to understand not only what goes wrong, if you like, as a population getting sick, but also how that impacts on the individual body and what the mechanism is at the level of the individual body's physiology in order to be able to design cures and to intervene. But then the third sort of research that medics tend to get involved in is called intervention research. It's often where you don't really understand the mechanism and you don't really know much about the epidemiology of it. You know there's a problem. Quite often you go and try something and you change people's diet, see if it has an effect. This is intervention research. It's quite well understood in medicine. It's not really talked about in architecture so much, but architecture and research by design is an aspect of exactly that. It's where we don't necessarily understand things absolutely formally, but we try, we create phenomena, we create new things, and in doing that, that's an absolutely valid area of research. Now, because I'm trying to span a whole range of different areas of research, what I need to do in this talk is actually to start off with a little bit of technology, and it's a sort of a series of tools for thinking with which we call space syntax. Some of you may have seen these before. They've been around for about, 25 years now. They were first developed by Bill Hillier at UCL, and his books are sort of the thorough version of what I'm going to be trying to present to you in about 5 minutes. So I'm going to start off with a little bit of technology about space syntax. I'm then going to take you straight into trying to understand a building, which is an advertising agency. It's just up the road, sort of the other side of Titchfield Street. It's a small advertising agency which has been growing rapidly and trying to innovate, not only in its advertising but also in its space. And I'm going to talk you through first, how we began to look at that and why it was driven forward actually by the way that technology is changing, why they were interested in understanding their building. But then to follow on from that, what that then means in terms of how we conceptualize the organization. Finally, I'm going to come back to the notion that organizations, as we think about them, if you like, as corporate things, the things that go on inside buildings, formal organizations, also have a relationship to what we see outside. So community, and the notion of community, I believe is an organizational concept. And I believe that there are such things as virtual organizations. I believe there are also such things as virtual communities, and that space constructs that. So that spatial design is actually about constructing the virtual organization, but it's also about constructing virtual communities. And that's why, as architects, we intervene at this scale, but also at that scale. It's because it's actually very similar laws, not necessarily precisely the same laws, but very similar laws of how space can be inhabited and the effects of spatial design on habitation that create the field of architecture and the field of architectural design. At the end, I'm going to move on to research that we're doing in the Virtual Reality Centre at UCL, which is to do with trying to simulate and construct computer simulations of emergent social groups. Now, it relates to the work that I will have talked about before. It relates to the work on real projects. However, it's in very early days, and so I have to say that it's not work which has yet been applied in anger on real life projects. Though I think it could be. Over the next year or so, I think it will be beginning to be applied. But that's about a slightly different view. Instead of looking at things from the point of view of space, we're beginning to start thinking about things from the point of view of individuals and the rule sets that individual people might be obeying in order to give rise to the global regularities of how people behave that we observe when we look at how people use buildings and how they use cities. Okay, so that's the introduction. How do I turn on the slide? Is it that one? Okay. Technical intro then. This is a space pattern. It's a space pattern of a town in the south of France, drawn in black so that you concentrate on space rather than the building objects. It's a very difficult thing to describe. I don't know, I don't think there's a single word that you could use that would describe that shape. And yet it's the geometry of that shape and the way that the parts of it come together into a whole, which is fundamental to how urban form works and how it's used. You can see things, you can see large fat lumps, squares, you can see a sort of incipient street grid in there, but it's not perfect in any sense. And yet, it's the type of place which, as you move around it at ground level, is immediately intelligible. You know where you are. There are quiet places and lively places, but you understand it almost instantly. And although we can't describe what pattern we call that plan form, at ground level we understand it intuitively. I think this is a property of all functioning architecture, that it's something that needs to be understood intuitively by people without any preconceptions or any education, by the general population, and the fact that that can happen means that it must be objective. There must be things that are shared in people's minds that are objective and real world that we can begin to understand. This is the little maths part. I have two little trees here. A tree in which there's a bottom space connected directly to every other space in the system on the left, and a tree in which there's a bottom space and every other space in the system is sequenced away from you on the right. We call the space on the left an integrated space. It's close to all other spaces in the system. We call the space on the right a segregated space because it's distanced from all other spaces in the system. In fact, you can measure, given any pattern, any graph of a network of spaces, you can measure the degree to which it falls between a bush or a long sequence. And it's because we can measure that we can begin to understand something about how space as global patterns distances or brings together, integrates or segregates different parts of a pattern. Now, in cities, we need first to say what a space is. In this room, this is actually a very good room to talk through this because it's the classic L shape. There's only one place in an L-shaped lecture theatre that you can possibly put the lecturer and the screen, and it has to be in the corner of the L. That is because I'm in a convex space which both captures that space over there and this space over here. I'm in the overlap between two convex pieces of space. The property of convexity is a mathematical property that if I can see him and he can see her, she can see me. We can't do that in the L shape. I can see him and her, but they can't see each other. Yeah? Now, the whole of our methodology of understanding, representing, and quantifying the way that space patterns are created rests on this kind of relationship between mathematics and society. There are social potentials built into the mathematics of the geometry of space, and what we try to do is to unpack those in such a way that we can begin to get to grips, if you like, with a mathematics of pattern form, which is the design side, the design variable in understanding social systems. Okay. What I've done here is I've taken the original map and I've passed through it, not the convex pieces of space, but the longest lines of sight. It turns out that lines of sight are, and movement actually, is where you can see and go. The shortest way between any A and any B is a straight line. And what we've done here is to draw, if you like, the shortest way between all A's and all B's in this town as a line map. It's been coloured up according to depth or shallowness. So each of those lines connects to a series of other lines. And each of those in turn connect to others, and each of those in turn connect to others. If what you do is you build a graph that takes each line at the bottom of the graph and then builds those it connects to above it, those they connect to above that, and so forth, you can build one of these tree-like structures that you can then measure and say how close to a bush is it, how close to a unilinear sequence of spaces is it, and the red ones are closer to bushes and the blue ones are closer to sequences. However, it's measuring a single pattern. And so what it's saying is, how does each space in this town relate to all other spaces, and how do those differ? How are they more accessible or more segregated from each other? Now, what we found here in a town is that you've got a bit of the outside is an orange, and then there's a couple of routes in from the exterior towards the crossroads at the heart of the town, which are in red. And in between the spokes of that wheel are blue spaces which are isolated or segregated. This is a very regular form which we find in a lot of town plans. We find it in London. This is a map of London inside the north and south circular roads approximately, and anybody can recognise Oxford Street is the red line in the centre. That is purely in terms of the mathematics of how Oxford Street relates to all the rest of the streets in that area of the city. It happens to be the shallowest space from everywhere else. You can see it also picks out the Edgware Road or the Kingsland Road, the route structure to the south of the river and so forth. These are purely morphological properties. The computer which has calculated these numbers knows nothing about land uses, knows nothing about development densities, it doesn't know where the shops are. All it knows about is there's a series of lines and they connect to each other. And yet, what I believe we've got here is something which makes intuitive sense, or sense for anybody who knows London, about something about its underlying structure. It turns out that that map of London is a particularly good predictor of a whole range of things, including patterns of where the traffic is. Here is a scattergram for 300-400 spaces, streets, where we've gone out and we've counted flows of cars going backwards and forwards on the street. On the left axis is the numbers of cars per hour, and going across on the horizontal axis is how red at the right-hand side, or blue at the left-hand side, those spaces are in the previous map. And there's a relationship. Each point is one space that we've observed. There's a relationship. The more integrated and redder spaces, the greater the flows. The more segregated and isolated, the poorer the flows, the lower the flows. It turns out that space structure in cities, and it turns out also in buildings, affects patterns of movement. It affects it both for cars at the large scale, but also for pedestrians at the smaller scale. It's predictable, yes? That doesn't mean that I can predict where you are going to go next. It's not a predictive tool at the level of determinism, if you like, at the level of an individual, but it is at the population. At the level of a whole population of people, there's a very high degree of predictability that the pattern of space gives rise to patterns of movement. And if you think about it, that's only common sense. We couldn't behave socially or economically in cities unless that were true. We wouldn't know where to put McDonald's if there wasn't regularity to where the passing trade is. Yeah? Every retailer will tell you that they go and count people flowing down the road, and they know that that's how many people are going to flow down the road every Saturday. It's a very simple thing to do. However, it does mean that you can begin to apply this sort of understanding, this sort of knowledge about systems, if you're trying to manipulate design in order to achieve particular effects. To make good locations for McDonald's, or poor locations for McDonald's, if that's what you prefer, is something which is a design variable which you can manipulate. And in doing that, you're not determining anybody, you are just working with the probabilities of the system. Okay, there's another little bit of technicality here. I've mentioned this measure of segregation or integration that says how each space relates to all others in the building or in the city that we're considering. But there are also local properties of space. A space has a particular size or shape. It has a particular number of other spaces that it connects to. I can stand here and I can count the number of other spaces that this room connects to. What I've got on the right-hand scattergrams here, these are two towns. The first one we've seen already. On the right-hand scatter, I've got the number of connections of each line plotted on the vertical axis, and the degree of integration, the global measure, the large-scale measure that takes account of how each space relates to all others, on the horizontal axis, and you can see that the two are related to each other. It's not necessarily the case. You can easily design systems which have highly integrated, shallow, two connected spaces and highly segregated, many connected spaces. We do it on modern housing estates, in fact. One of the tragedies of modernism is that we've destroyed the relationship between the local and the global. However, in types, you find a very good relationship, tight relationship between the local properties of space and their global properties. And we call this intelligibility. We say that the degree to which this scatter is tight allows you to predict from what you can see locally where you are in the large scale. Now, intelligibility sort of smacks of something to do with psychology. And I'd like to stress that this is nothing to do with psychology yet. We think it might have to do with psychology, but we're not sure about that. All it is a measure of something to do with the pattern of the space structure. And you can design systems that are highly intelligible, where you can predict precisely from local things that you can see, things about all the stuff you can't see. You can design systems which completely confuse you from that point of view. They become unpredictable. What we have found is that modern housing estates, large hospitals, a whole range of different building types, our Bartlett building down the road, these are highly unintelligible buildings and highly unintelligible urban systems. And there's anecdotal evidence that the psychology is related also to the morphology. At the moment, we can't take it much further than that, but we're working on it. And so what I want to come back to at the end is our approach to how we're trying to understand the psychological level of how people interact with their environment and how people interact with other people, because I think that's critical to understanding properly the role of architecture. You can do the same sort of thing inside large buildings. This is a black and white map of a large laboratory building. This is a spatial analysis. That was only one floor of the building. It's sort of pyramid shaped. It's the same kind of thing. And we have done a large number of studies, both of cities and of buildings and of different kinds of buildings, on which a lot of what I'm going to present to you next really depends, and on which all of this sort of rests. It rests on a whole range, not only of research projects, but of live applications projects where we are working for clients with real problems and real design problems. And we use those to generate, if you like, the knowledge base about how different kinds of organisation and different kinds of building work, how people use space, and how that knocks on into other factors. Now that's what I'm going to move on to next, but I'd first like to run a video. Let me turn that off. Of a bit of office space, it should be. Please wait. I shouldn't need that. There we are. Right. Okay. This is a chunk of office space, and it's a very dull video in some ways, but what I want you, it's actually part of the research work. What we were doing here is videoing for a long period a very small area of space, which in this advertising agency that I'm going to go on to talk about, is one of the critical areas of the plan. It's where everybody tends to meet everybody. You can see at the moment what people do. They're just walking backwards and forwards slowly. Occasion, somebody's been hailed there. Conversation occurs. You let this thing run for a while, and what you'll find is that it hots up. Somebody's actually just sitting down to the right-hand side there, so a bit of conversation takes place. Now, there are two properties here. You can see that what's going on is a couple of people come together, going to talk to the person who's sitting just around the corner off shot. People continually moving past on this corridor space, and from time to time stopping off to join into conversations that are taking place just over the counter. Some of those conversations are actually completely opportunistic. The two ladies who started this thing off are still just standing there. Neither of those are from here. They just happen to have met here. Other people have set up a little conversation group on the right-hand side where they're talking to the person who is actually working here. And somebody else is coming along to do the same sort of thing. Now, it's trying to understand what's going on here and what the effect of architecture is on this level of interaction that we're really about. What we need to understand is, how does spatial pattern in buildings relate to this level of what goes on? Is it completely random? Is it understandable? Or is it something into which you can intervene? And if you can intervene in it, how should you intervene in it? I think that's enough of that. Let's stop that for a moment. And back to the slides. Oops, that's me on there. Right. Okay. Where we were in this building was actually at the top of the plan there. So we were at the top, on the right-hand side, looking towards the left. Curved wall around the centre. This is a 1930s sort of office building, light wells and staircases and loos and so forth in the middle. Open plan all around the outside. Curvy wall, which was the sort of red wall on the left of the video, which contains meeting rooms. The organisation here is an advertising agency. It set itself up about 8 years ago. It's been Advertising Agency of the Year for a couple of years in the last 8 years. It sets itself going really by, it distinguishes itself from other advertising agencies on the basis of innovation. And it's got a very particular view, particular corporate strategy, which is that the advertising world at the moment, traditional advertising agencies are pretty much bound to television production, television adverts. Everything is about TV adverts. That's great, so long as you've only got 4 commercial channels. Come digital TV, you've got 500 channels. How are you going to place your person's message in front of an audience if the audience size has dwindled? Yes? You can't tell where it's going to be. There's a problem there. And what they said is, well, we've got to be much more innovative. And they said the whole basis of this organisation is that we're innovative and we sell ourselves to clients who want innovative advertising. Just to give you a for instance, these are the guys who run the Tango campaign. And the Tango campaign, everybody knows, got a big hand and somebody comes out and tangos people. At the time we were studying this building, the John Major was being attacked by Redwood, the Conservative leadership sort of battle. And there was a big sort of vote going on in the House of Commons where Redwood was going to throw out John Major. What they did was these guys organised for the Tango man with his big hand to be down in front of the House of Commons waiting for the announcement. And they were hoping that John Major would be thrown out. Because they wanted them to come out and tango. You know, say, you've been tangoed. They were sitting in the advertising agency watching all the TV channels, and all the channels were sitting there waiting on their news programmes, waiting basically for the announcement. And they were sitting there with stopwatches, counting the numbers of seconds of airtime that they had managed to achieve for Mr. Tango during, you know, on live broadcast TV during that time. And they were just sitting there and they were saying, you know, that's 10 seconds from Channel 4, that's 5 seconds from BBC. And they got enormous amounts of airtime for the price of an actor. Yeah, so what they were trying to do is a quite different way of getting your product in front of the audience. Yeah? Now that only fits for certain products. For an irreverent, you know, young person's drink like Tango, that's great. But what they try to do is to innovate in their way of thinking about getting the message in front of different audiences. Now, how do they achieve that? Well, they felt that they had a very important role of buildings in this, and the first thing they did was to do away with the department boundaries around particular groups. So a group of creatives in a conventional advertising agency sits at one end of the building, and account managers sit in another part of the building, and the finance people sit in another part of the building. What they did here is they shuffled everybody. So you're always sitting next to somebody who's not from your discipline background. That's the first thing. Second thing they did was to shuffle everybody according to campaign. So you're always sitting next to somebody who's working on a different campaign to yours. The next thing they did was they banned internal memoranda. They said face-to-face conversations are better. If we need to communicate, get up and walk. 2 reasons. Face-to-face is better, but also that means that you may walk past somebody you didn't know that you needed to see, and that could be good for innovation. The third thing they did was ban internal telephone calls for the same reason. Yeah? Face-to-face is all most important. Get up and move. And then they shuffled everybody every 6 months. So just at the time when you get to know who your neighbours are and everybody knows where you are, the whole organisation moves. Yeah? Now, 2 reasons for that. One is it means you're sitting next to somebody else and the whole thing can't fossilise. The next reason is that it's a good opportunity to throw away all the rubbish that accumulates in advertising agencies and architects' offices. Yeah? Just get rid of it. Nothing like a move to do that. Okay, so that was the state when we came, well, that was the state when they set the thing up. But then the organisation expanded and they moved on to the floor below as well. As soon as they did that, they realised they had a problem, and that was when we got involved. They moved on to part of the floor below, and they tried to set up a similar kind of thing with circulation space and open plan space and so forth. And all of a sudden they found that the people on the floor above didn't know the people on the floor below. The people on the floor below never met the people on the floor above. One lot thought the other lot weren't there or weren't working or whatever. And the whole culture of the organisation began to deteriorate, and they realised they had a problem. So what they asked is there anything we can do inside this building? And because we're expanding, we're thinking of taking on the lease for the rest of the floor. Should we do that, or do we actually need to be thinking about a different building? So what we did is we came in and we started studying it. The green here, green lines on that plan, are observed traces of where people move. So what we do is we go in, we look in great detail at how people move around inside space. And so this is somebody going back every hour over 2 days and counting or tracing people onto a plan for during a 3-minute period, and then overlaying those on top of each other. And what you end up with is, on this floor, a very clear pattern of circulation around the curvy corridor that filters off and gets much less towards the end, the edges, towards the periphery of the building. The second thing we do is we analyse its spatial structure using very similar tools to the ones I showed you on the city. In this case, it's every line of sight that sort of is tangential to objects, and it gives a very thorough picture of the degree of integration and segregation, isolation and accessibility of the different areas in the plan. The area we videoed, where everybody kept meeting, is the red part up at the top. It turns out that if you count the numbers of people flowing through different chunks of space, the real people, that it correlates very precisely with the coloured up pattern of lines that I've just shown you on the analysis. And it's that sort of level of relationship. Very, very precise predictive model you can build. On the floor below, the pattern of circulation, it's interesting because the differences here are that there are 2 main long circulation runs. The one on the left running top to bottom, and the one on the right underneath the windows running top to bottom. And in fact, that's one of the critical problems on that floor, is that they've separated people coming in and out of the floor from people moving around within the floor. Those 2 groups of people are actually separated by the way those 2 circulation runs are established. Second point here is that the pattern of integration, the redness, the most integrated space, is actually a pretty meaningless space down at the bottom end of the plan that just happens to connect the more isolated meeting rooms to the work area. The entrance to that floor from the staircase is actually relatively isolated. So you're coming into a building here in an isolated location, where on the floor above, you come into it where it's buzzing. In fact, we did an analysis of the AA and the Bartlett some time ago. The Bartlett Waits House building on Gordon Street, disastrous building, has exactly this property. You come in segregated space, and you can never find the stairs, and you can never find your way around. The AA, you come in on integrated space, and all the main facilities, this lecture hall, the library, the bar, and so forth, are all essentially things that open up the main vertical circulation integration core, and it means it's a shallow core building. So we believe that there are very good reasons why the AA has a culture which is, if you like, open and interactive, which the Bartlett has to fight against continuously because its building is bloody awful. Yeah? I'm allowed to say that, of course. Second thing we do is observe not only patterns of movement, but patterns of static activity. So in this case, red dots are actually people sitting down working, or sitting down, just sitting down. Yellow dots are people who are standing up. Yellow circles go around conversation groups. And if you look at this plan, there's a fair amount of yellow dots, and there are also conversation groups that capture yellow dots and red dots, or just yellow dots together, and so forth. If we go onto the floor below, far fewer conversation groups. It's much less interactive down there. And if you exclude the meetings in the meeting rooms, very few interactions going on. And those that there are tend to be grouped around red dots. So it's people talking to their neighbour, and not much of that going on. In fact, what we're saying is that the building owners, the advertising agency, the clients for this, were correct in thinking that there were things wrong with the fourth floor. You know, they weren't just being arbitrary about it. And we're beginning to be able to pinpoint, in numeric terms, some of those properties, what the things were that seemed to be going wrong. There was less interaction, there was into-out movement separated from movement on the floor, and groups of people from upstairs, if they did come downstairs to go to meetings, were not brought into contact with those on that floor. I'm going to rush through these. Puts the two sets of things together, and go on to a little bit more of the epidemiology of it, if you like. Of those previous drawings, what we can take is, for any space, the number of people who are talking in that space, a piece of space, a convex piece of space, number of people talking in it, and the number of people moving through it. On the fifth floor, there's a positive trend. Yeah? For a statistician, this is a complete mess. But for us, what you can see is a positive trend of there being spaces where, in general, as you get more people moving through, you also have more talking. Some of the spaces, those four that go off sharply on the left-hand side, have relatively little talking, but they all happen to be on the main circulation corridor, right on the circulation corridor. And people talked just off it. But there's a positive trend passing through there. So this is just the main floor. If we go on to the floor below, what you find is that the same relationship between movement and talking goes in the opposite direction. In fact, it's a much tighter relationship. A statistician would be more happy with this. Where you get more talking, you get less movement. Where you get more movement, you get less talking. And if you like, it's separating those two classes of activity. Two other differences on the fourth and fifth floors, which are actually quite interesting, even though numbers makes it boring. The numbers of seated and standing people. 10 people standing per observation round, 40 people sitting per observation round. The ratio of the two is 0.27. 27% of people are standing. On the fourth floor, only 15% of people are standing. The numbers are much lower, but it's a much more sedentary floor. So what's going on the fifth floor is there's much more movement, much more standing around, and when you see people standing, it tends to be because they've stopped to carry out a conversation of some sort. On the floor below, everybody's sitting down, beavering away, but what we also found is that by and large they used to get up and walk upstairs to socialise. So you get lower occupancy rates on the lower floor, higher occupancy rates on the upper floor. The next thing we did is a thing we've done in a whole range of buildings, is carry out a questionnaire of who knows who and who finds who useful in their work. So you give this list. There's a list of everybody in the organisation. Sandra Smith, top there. How often do I see you from daily to never? And do you find her useful in your work? And you give this out to everybody, and you get 60% back. everybody has to sign their own one, so we know who has said who else is useful. It turns out that's not particularly interesting. What's interesting is how often Sandra Smith is cited as being useful by everybody else in the organisation. How frequently is she seen? Now, there's an immediate relationship, actually, between the number of people who find somebody useful, vertical axis, and how frequently they're seen, 1 to 5 scale, on average by everybody else, horizontal axis. It's a positive trend again. The more frequently you are seen, the more useful you tend to be found. However, it's messy. Yeah? It's tight down the bottom end. If you're never seen, you're not found useful by and large, yeah? Unless you're one of these two, which I'll go on to explain. Oh, wait a minute. Back one. Most useful person, top right-hand corner, most frequently seen as well, happens to be the computer technician, yeah? The person who keeps your computer going. Of course, that's his job. He's not the only computer technician. There's another one down here in the bottom left-hand corner, actually, who's never seen and is not found useful. Yeah, he may be useful, but he's not found useful. So you have to abstract out those jobs in the agency which are going to make you obviously a most useful person because of your job. And there are various sorts of those. But what we've done here is we've taken single account staff, people who work on a single advertising account. Yeah, it's not multiple ones. They're just working on that. It's a much tighter thing. There are still some particularly useful people and some less useful people, but it's a much tighter scatter. That's one of those 2 points on the left, yeah, that's gone up here. These are all the founding partners. All founding partners in the organisation are obviously going to be more useful, yeah, for 2 reasons or 3 reasons. One is they damn well ought to be because they're the founding partners. They have the most experience. Second is they sign your expenses sheets and all those sorts of things. Third is, you know, who knows, they might get to see the questionnaire. You know, there's all sorts of possibilities here. Big variation, though, in terms of frequency of being seen, which I'll explain in a second. These 2, now this is the creative staff. Yeah, so these are all the creatives. Creatives in an advertising agency, by and large, aren't particularly useful to anybody else. It's not their job to be. Their job is to sit there being creative for the client. And they're all in this tight bunch down at the bottom. The 2 outliers here are the 2 founder partners who are creatives. One, on the left-hand side, had actually been away for a 6-month sabbatical just before we did this study. And he's much less frequently seen, and because of that, found less useful, but he's still more useful than any of the other creatives. So what we can do in this kind of way is begin to unpack issues of organisational structure, status, task, and so forth, and show that for particular tasks and statuses, you can begin to understand something about not only you know, what it is that they're doing, but also that there appears to be a basic case that the more frequently you are seen, the more useful you tend to be found by other people in the organisation. Now, all organisations are interested in this. The main expense that people spend in an organisation is on the human resources. Buildings are cheap compared to human resources. It's an ongoing expenditure. The reason you get people together in buildings, you know, you have a business unit working on something and a business unit working on something or other else, why do you bother putting them all together in a single building? Well, the reason is because you want these people to be useful to each other outside their immediate group. Yeah? That makes sense. There's all sorts of arguments at the moment that new technologies are going to allow us to work at home all the time and so forth. Well, I think that, you know, the indications are probably the reverse. That new technologies will allow us to work at home some of the time, but the rest of the time we're going to have to maximise on spatial contact in order to make organisations make maximum use of their human resources. What we've done is go across a whole range of organisations doing exactly the same sort of methods I've just shown you. And this scatter is a scatter where each point is an organisation. And each organisation has been, it goes across the horizontal axis according to how spatially integrated or segregated its buildings are on average, and it's on the vertical axis according to how useful people are found by people outside their immediate work group on average. Yeah? So that questionnaire method allows you to locate an organisation. And we find a relationship across the whole lot. The more you isolate the building part from part, the less useful people are found by people outside their immediate group. The more you integrate and bring together, the more useful they're found. Now, this is a major finding. What it's saying is that the hunches people have that buildings can inhibit or facilitate organisations which are active and innovate, and organisations which sort of close down and become dinosaurs, seems for the first time to have some real substantial backing for it. But how is it possible? What is it that seems to be going on here? Well, if you think back to the initial video, what we saw was patterns of movement, people moving past in space, and then from time to time conversations being struck up with somebody just working over the countertop. We think that if what you do is you segregate and isolate a building plan part from part and remove through movement from where people's work locations are, then you're creating the conditions in which those conversations never take place. We worked with some sociologists who analysed video of this sort, and what we found was something like 80% of work-related conversations take place by people recruiting people into conversation as they walk past. It's unpredictable, it's against Taylor, it's not a goal-oriented form of organisation, because you don't know who's going to walk past. But every now and again, somebody walks past and you recruit them into a conversation. Now, space impacts on that. If you're aware of the pattern of circulation from your work location, then you have the opportunity to recruit. If the pattern of space brings people past you, you have the opportunity to recruit. And both of those are spatial characteristics. What this organisation then went on to do is to say, well, okay, let's correct some of the problems that we found. They changed some things on the 4th floor, but they instituted a new form of working. It went with new forms of spatial design. But the basic form was, they said, right, instead of moving everybody every 6 months, we're going to have everybody move every day. And in another organisation, go to Arthur Anderson's, they would call that hot desking. And yet, this is quite different, because in hot desking, what you try to do is to stop everybody complaining about not having a desk by making all the desks the same as each other. Yeah, every workstation, you try and make it as similar as possible to the next in hot desking arrangements. In this, which they called romping, what they did was they said, no, what we're going to do, everybody needs cellular space some of the time. The boss needs it, the secretary needs it. Everybody needs interaction some of the time. The boss needs it, the secretary needs it. It's not a status-related thing, it's a task-related and a personality-related thing. So what we'll do is we'll create a whole range of different environments, some active, some passive, some light, some dark, some hot, some cold, yeah? Environmental qualities of all sorts. Some with lots of people moving through, some more or less cellular. And people can then occupy those as they need to at that time for that particular job that they have to do, in this minute. Now, what we found as soon as that happened, I'm not sure if got the right set of things. Let's skip some slides here because I think we're running short of time. What happened as soon as we did that is, this is actually it. Possible there. Is that we actually managed to promote far greater levels of interaction on the 4th floor, and because that became an isolated, relatively isolated location in the building where people could retreat to, but because you weren't constraining people to being on the 4th floor, you're actually making use of the fact that it is spatially isolated. It's not something that you get stuck with. It becomes something that actually turns the properties of the building to positive benefit. At the same time, the coffee bar interaction at the top area, the most interactive location, is turned into a bar in which you can turn up and plug in your laptop. So if you've been out of the office for 2 days, you can come in and spend the first morning there, and you'll catch up on all the gossip, and you'll probably see everybody, because that's where everybody moves past everybody else. But that, again, is available not just to a few people, but to everybody in the organisation. So the basic form in which these guys have moved on to working is something where they've made minor spatial changes, but major changes to how they run their whole organisation sort of method of working. Now, can we run the other videotape? If I turn that off. What we've been trying to do in order to understand how it is that organisations like this work, it's partly to do with analysing spatial patterns and observing precisely, the regularities, the statistical regularities of behaviour. It's partly also to do with trying to understand something about the individual psychology of how people relate to other people, how people recruit people into conversations, and how space has an effect on that. Now, one way into this is work that we're just beginning to do on developing, if you like, simulations of emergent phenomena. So what we have here are a series of little slug-like things where each slug has a script, yes, and its script lets it recognise other slugs, and it's got a little rule set. So a slug will move towards another slug. If it can't see another slug, it'll turn around. If it gets too close to another slug, it'll turn away. And that's the rule set. What you end up with is a social group, yes, because you end up with a group of slugs. Any time a slug tries disappearing off into the distance, it sees no other slugs, it turns around and comes back. A very simple rule system can give rise to a global phenomena of a social group. This one on the left here should be turning around. You can't possibly see any other slugs. I expect he'll come back soon. They have a certain boredom threshold. Another thing that you find happening if you run it for long enough is that you get groups which can part. So you can get speciation, if you like. You can get two groups which become coherent entities in themselves but drift apart on the screen into different areas of the world. Oh yeah, he's coming back. He's decided. He's a bit slow, that one. Now, the reason we're doing this is partly because we're writing the code that allows you to give behaviours to objects, and it's a good way of debugging it. It's partly that what we're interested in doing is simulating the kinds of behaviour that we've seen real people do, and we're asking questions which are, how simple can the rule sets be that might give rise to lifelike properties for real populations of people? Or do we have to give everybody goals and motives and personalities and belief in Margaret Thatcher and God knows what in order to be able to simulate societies? We believe you probably don't. We think that sort of 90% of what you see going on in buildings happens because of the ways that people interact with people, the way that people interact with objects, and those sets of interactions are actually the stuff of architecture. We never know when we design a building the personalities of the people eventually who are going to be using that building. So the stuff of architecture can't be all that other stuff. It has to be to do with the emergent properties of distributed systems of people moving around space. Can we fast forward this a bit? There's another... Whoop, stop. That's it. Okay. So what we're doing in the ad agency here is a very similar set of automata to those slugs. They each know how they move around. In fact, what we've got is little conversation groups that appear from time to time, but people get bored with each other. We've discovered that what we have to do to make some of the sorts of phenomena that we see happen is add additional rule sets in, one of which may be boredom or memory or goals. But what we're trying to do is see what the minimum number are, and what's the range of possible rule sets and possible paradigms of rule set that we might use to reproduce our statistically observed regularities of spatial behaviour. Finally, you may all have seen the sort of this screensaver. It's actually an emergent behaviour group. There's a single or very simple set of rules here. Sharks try to get to the centre, but if they get too close to another shark, then they turn away. In fact, they turn upwards. So when you see them swimming upwards very rapidly, it's because they've got too close to somebody or other else. What emerges after a while, if you watch this, is a big circulation. They all go around in a sort of clockwise direction around the centre. And it's a very simple, simple sort of example of one of the chaotic attractors. It's a periodic attractor in which everybody's trying to get to the centre, not everybody can get to the centre, and yet they're interacting with each other in a way that's essentially random. They swim up, and you can never predict where the next shark is going to be. It's totally unpredictable, but has a regularity in terms of its emergent behaviour. I think that's probably about it for the moment. I think I've just about run over time. Thank you. Happy to. No questions. Easy.
Do you have any results from this simulation of behavior within the plant?
No, it's very early days on the simulation work. What we're trying to do is to create the rule sets in the automata that will then lead to us having the patterns of behavior that we've observed in the real building, and then throw in a new building and see whether or not you get reasonable patterns of behavior out of it. Until we've done that, I don't know what a result would look like. It takes doing that set of things before we would even have a result. A result is going to be something that is somehow measurably a lifelike pattern of behavior in a building in which we hadn't developed it. Yes, in an environment in which we hadn't developed it.
And the two other questions are really brief. Regards software, hardware, and video. The map of the market.
Website.
Okay. Fair enough.
Okay, two websites. There's www.spacesyntax.com. That does all the space syntax stuff. And the virtual reality stuff, these agents sort of things, is www.vr.ucl.ac.uk. .ucl.ac.uk. Yeah.
Any basic book?
Space syntax, two basic books. The Social Logic of Space from 1984 by Hillier and Hansen, and the latest one is The Space is the Machine, which is now out in paperback at $16.95. I saw it today. The Space is the Machine by Bill Hillier, again Cambridge University Press last year. Yeah. On the virtual reality stuff, nothing. Well, I mean, there's acres of cyberspace type books around, artificial life books from the conference and things like that, but yeah, there's a big field of literature there which somebody can talk to people about.
Can we simulate this kind of thing from like home PCs or no way?
Yes, you can. Yeah, I mean, there are all sorts of things that you can do if you're interested in that. The issues are always to do with processing time and how complicated you make the rule sets. If you're trying to play with things, then there's nice things like Star Logo, which you can download from MIT, which let you do all sorts of cellular automata kinds of games, which are quite nice. The stuff which all the slugs is done in is a program called Pangea, which again you can download from the web, but I've forgotten where the website is. But it'll be linked out of one of these, yeah. But the download version isn't very good. You really need to come in and get a real one. Maybe we ought to change the download version. What we were running all those slugs on is an enormous, great big Silicon Graphics computer, which nobody can afford.